Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us again tonight we do another version of our Safer at Home series. I think people are really liking our virtual talks. I was being somewhat of a novice at Zoom when this whole thing started. I had my heart in my throat, but people seem to really like this, and I'm glad you're joining us again tonight. I'm Mark Schmidt. I haven't had a chance to make your acquaintance. I'm the executive director for the Museums on the Green. First of all, I want to thank our sponsors for these series, Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings for making these talks possible. Also want to make sure that you know that this is being recorded. And at the end of our talk, as we've been doing, you'll notice on the bottom of your screen that there's a chat feature. So if you got a question for the speaker, you can just type in a question right at the end, and we'll be answering those. And also, we want to make sure that we give a shout out to our friends over at Eight Cousins Bookseller. Because they have copies of all the books, including this one. So make sure that you visit your local bookseller. One of the downsides of doing these virtual talks, yes, besides the fact I don't give you guys cookies right now, is that I don't get a chance to actually meet in person the person that's actually doing the talking, and so I was really this is someone I was really hoping to meet in person. So I greatly appreciate the fact that she's here doing this virtually. Karen Abbott is a New York Times best-selling author. She has written for New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Smithsonian Magazine. Has appeared on the History Channel, CBS Sunday Morning, AMC, the Travel Channel, and the Discovery Channel. The book she's going to be talking about tonight, The Ghosts of Eden Park, won an Edgar Award finalist for Best Fact Crime, an Indie Next Pick, an Amazon Best Book of 2019, and the Smithsonian Magazine Top 10 History Book for 2019. And in one of the all-time great quotes, the Wall Street Journal said about Karen Abbott, she is, quote, one of the masters of the art of narrative nonfiction. Would you welcome Karen Abbott? Karen, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you guys so much for being here. I too was very much looking forward to getting up to Cape Cod, and especially in this syrupy New York summer, but I'm really happy to just connect with you all virtually. So thanks for coming. A little bit informal compared to what we usually do, I suppose. My parrot might be chirping in the background, so if you hear a bird, it's just my parrot, and hopefully he'll behave himself for the most part. But without further ado, I'd like to talk about my most recent book. It is called The Ghosts of Eden Park. Here is the hardcover jacket. I still need to put up the paperback jacket. It's quite different, but still sort of the same Roaring 20s mysterious mood going on. So without further ado, I usually start talking about how I get the ideas for my books. And I usually get ideas for my books from going to libraries and digging into old musty archives and maybe reading out of print books and seeing what kind of tidbits I might be able to find. But I got the idea for The Ghosts of Eden Park actually from watching television, specifically the television show Boardwalk Empire, which was an HBO show for about 5 seasons. It was really brilliant. I don't know how many of you watched the show, but it really perfectly captured the dawn of Prohibition. Bootleggers were still trying to figure out how to circumvent all of the new laws, and nobody had yet heard of Al Capone. So there was a minor character named George Remus. He was so innovative and so cuckoo, and he pretty much stole every scene he was in. Here is the actor Glenn Fleshler playing George Remus. If you look at the pictures side by side of the two men, they're actually uncannily similar looking. And I'll give you some context for this slide here. So this is George Remus in his mansion in Cincinnati, and he's on the phone with Steve Buscemi's character. They're conducting some business. Things are getting a little bit heated. And George Remus, who spoke of himself in the third person, said, "Remus finds you petty and resentful." And Steve Buscemi on the other end says, "Well, Remus can go F himself." Um, and it was just a funny scene to me. There were all kinds of Abbott and Costello-esque instances of George Remus speaking of himself in the third person and people getting very confused. And I wondered if George Remus was actually a real historical figure. And indeed he was. And I started looking into him and realized that he was going to be much more interesting than anything portrayed on Boardwalk Empire. The real George Remus also spoke of himself in the third person. And he said things like, "This is going to be a hell of a Christmas for Remus. So many people want to kill Remus." And my personal favorite of his in the third person, he said, "Remus's brain exploded." You'll actually have to read the book to determine whether a brain explosion actually occurred. But I just realized he was going to be a fascinating subject for a nonfiction book. His story is truly stranger than fiction, and I was really excited to dig into his life. So before I get into George Remus, I would like to talk for a minute about researching George Remus. This is part of my research, a picture of part of my research at the Yale University Law Library in New Haven, Connecticut. Now, as soon as I found out that there was a trial transcript about Remus, which is very rare for the 1920s, by the way. Usually trial transcripts are lost, misplaced, destroyed, not archived. Things are conveniently, disappear over the decades. And it was just really a research gift to realize that this transcript existed. I went up to New Haven and spent a week there. From opening to closing, I sat in the Yale Law Library and Xeroxed every single page of this manuscript. There were 5,500 pages. There were about 12 volumes, all this thick. And look at this beautiful overhead scanner. I don't know if there's any research buffs there, but this was about the sexiest thing I've ever seen, this research scanner. It's going to make me sound like a geek, but it was wonderful. Usually with a scanner, you're sort of fighting with the book and you can't get the pages and it's kind of a mess and your arms start hurting. But this was a glorious bit of research. I don't think I've ever had so much fun in my life that I did sitting at this scanner, which sounds, again, very sad, but it's my favorite part of my job to do this research. And this research had some really incredible details, not just about George Remus personally, but about glimpses into 1920 life and 1920 mindset. One of my favorite details was that George Remus did not wear underwear. Apparently in the 1920s, this was cause for great alarm. It was apparently the sign of an unsound mind. And I sort of really enjoyed that. It took me about 4 months to go through this entire trial transcript, all 5,500 pages. And I'm a very rigorous outliner. And my resulting outline from going through this manuscript was about 85,000 words, which is pretty much almost the length of the book itself. So quite a bit of research to be found here, just such a rich seam of information about this man and his life in the 1920s. So how do you solve a problem like George Remus? Here's George Remus. His life was much more interesting and dramatic than it was portrayed on Boardwalk Empire. And he had quite a difficult childhood. He emigrated with his family from Germany when he was about 6 or 7 years old, and the family settled in Chicago. And Remus's father, in his own words, was a quote, mean and abusive alcoholic. Remus had to quit school at age 13 to start supporting his family. His father could no longer work. And he got a job in his uncle's pharmacy in Chicago. And he really devoted himself to this job. He called himself a druggist devil boy. Remus had quite a way with words, as I'll talk about that later on. And he stayed at the pharmacy pretty much all of his time. He often even slept in a cot in the back room. And I believe that was because he was actually afraid of his father's tantrums. As I said, his father was an abusive jerk. But Remus wasn't satisfied with being a pharmacist. He eventually did become a pharmacist, took over his uncle's pharmacies. He made his clients, by the way, call him Dr. Remus. He was not a doctor. But while he was working at his pharmacy, he also studied law late at night. He wanted to become a lawyer. And Remus did pass the Illinois bar, and he quickly made a name for himself, being a Chicago defense attorney. And became known for his courtroom antics. Now, Remus would leap across the courtroom, he would cry, he would scream, he would tear at his hair, he would attack opposing counsel and sort of end up in a tangle of limbs on the courtroom floor. His many admirers called him the Napoleon of the Chicago bar, but he had just as many detractors, and they called him the weeping and crying Remus. which I thought was a great nickname. So in early 1920, George Remus began to notice a new type of client on his docket. And this was men who were charged with violating prohibition laws. And these men were making really easy money. Remus was constantly amazed with the ease with which they would pay their fines, slap down a couple $100s on his desk, they would pay the fine, and they would be back doing their, conducting their bootleg business with really no interruption. Now, George Remus knew he was smarter than any of these men, and he decided that he himself would have a chance to clean up in prohibition. That was his own quote. So he scoured the Volstead Act for a loophole, using his pharmaceutical background and his legal background, and he succeeded in finding a loophole. And that loophole was that with a physician's prescriptions, it was legal to buy, manufacture, and sell alcohol for quote-unquote medicinal purposes. Now, nobody was using alcohol for medicinal purposes. It was quite a joke. Remus himself, in a customary flourish of language, called it the greatest comedy, the greatest perversion of justice that I have ever known of any civilized country in the world. And a plan began to take shape in his mind. So this is Imogene Remus. Well, actually Imogene Holmes when they met. She was a major part of his plan. And I just love this photograph so much, just the detail in the hat and just sort of sly look in her eyes. But he met Imogene Holmes. She was a dust girl in a Chicago law office, and she would stay late at night. She was going through a very ugly divorce. She was a single mother. Her husband was never coming home. He was spending all of their money. And Remus himself was also going through marital problems with his first wife. She actually filed a divorce complaint where on the official complaint, she said that Remus, quote, had a habit of coming home early in the morning. That was the actual language on a 1915 divorce filing, which I thought was really funny. And so they would commiserate about their mutually miserable marriages. So they decided to, leave their spouses. They began to fall in love. They wanted to plan for their own wedding. And Remus confided in Imogene about all of his bootlegging plans. He sought her advice. He thought she was a very smart woman. And he gave her many nicknames. And his first and most important nickname for her was, quote, the Prime Minister, which sort of gives you an idea of the respect that Remus had for her ideas and her vision and how she might contribute to his bootlegging empire. Now, Imogene Remus, on the other hand, only had one nickname for George Remus, and that nickname was Daddy. So that might tell you something about the nature of their relationship and how she reviewed George Remus. So they got married. George and Imogene Remus got married, and they moved to Cincinnati, Ohio from Chicago. Now, Cincinnati was a very strategic location. 80% of the country's pre-prohibition bonded whiskey was located within a 300-mile radius of Cincinnati. It was also a growing, bustling city with easy access to Chicago, New York, other big cities where he would conduct his business. And they bought this really fabulous mansion pictured here. This was in Price Hill, Cincinnati, which at the time was the most, the fanciest, the most lavish, wealthiest neighborhood in Cincinnati. And they decided to do extensive renovations on the home. They began planning on how to give it their own style. And as a gift for his new bride, George Remus put the deed in Imogene's name. And this was one of many decisions that he would come to regret. Right before they got married, Imogene Remus confided to a friend of hers that she didn't really want to marry Remus. She just wanted to, quote, roll him for his role. So that again gives you another idea of what she was seeking in her marriage with Remus. So this is George Connors. If anybody's read the book, and by the way, if you've read the book, no, please don't spoil the ending. I tried to write it like a whodunit, and I don't want people to know who kills who before they get a chance to read. But anyway, this is George Connors. He's a very good friend of Remus's in the book. George Remus met him shortly after moving to Cincinnati. He was sort of a stabilizing force in Remus's life. They had opposite temperaments. Remus was very hot-headed, prone to just leaping up and attacking people. And George Connors was a calm and collected kind of guy. And they really hit it off. And George Connors was also a well-respected businessman and real estate person in Cincinnati. And he was very useful to Remus in that regard. So once George Remus had George Connors in place as his lieutenant, he began to implement his prohibition scheme. Now, Remus's idea had 4 very important points, and I'm going to go through them for you so you can just really appreciate the genius of what Remus was doing. His first action was to buy distilleries to gain possession of that pre-prohibition bonded whiskey. The second was to acquire wholesale drug companies, which of course would tie into the whole medicinal purposes aspect of the business. The third was to obtain withdrawal permits that would allow him to remove whiskey from the warehouses and ostensibly sell it on the legal medicinal market. But the fourth point, and this was Remus's true genius, he organized his own transportation company. So his men would hijack the trucks that were carrying all of the liquor, ostensibly again, headed to the legal medicinal market. They would hijack those trucks and divert all of that legal whiskey to the illegal market, where Remus would sell it at any price he named. So he was really robbing Remus to pay Remus. And it was such a brilliant, ingenious plan. Remus called it the Circle, basically, because he was robbing Remus to pay Remus. Within 1 year of launching the Circle, George Remus owned 35% of all of the alcohol in the United States, which is just a staggering figure if you think about it. And of course, Remus being Remus, he had a comment on this in the third person. Remus was in the whiskey business, he'd say, and Remus was the biggest man in the business. Cincinnati is the American mecca for good liquor, and America has to come to Remus to get it. Now, his fortune was estimated at this time to be anywhere between $20 million and $40 million. That is not a figure adjusted for inflation. That's actually in 1921 money. Again, a staggering figure. And the irony of all of this, George Remus, who made $40 million in bootlegging, was a teetotaler who never himself had a drop to drink. So this was a very important part of Remus's empire. This is Death Valley, and it was a storage facility located just outside of Cincinnati. And Connors found this piece of property for Remus after Remus was the victim of a whiskey pirate attack. Now, I'll explain what whiskey pirates were. They were not pirates of the ahoy matey variety. They were actually roving bands of thieves who would descend upon a whiskey warehouse. They would bound and gag the watchman. They would cut the telephone lines, and they would steal every last barrel of liquor inside. So Remus one night was coming home on the bridge that connects Kentucky and Cincinnati, and he got stopped by a bunch of whiskey pirates. The men jumped out and started attacking him. Remus, being sort of a feisty guy who really prided himself on his athletic prowess, got out and started fighting back. He put up a very good fight, but the men did manage to take all of Remus's whiskey. And in fact, about a week or so later, Remus found the head of the whiskey pirates, and the man said to him, you know, you put up such a good fight that you deserve to keep all of your liquor. And Remus, being the brilliant businessman that he was, ended up hiring the whiskey pirate and all of his men so they would never rob him again. But Remus did not want to be the victim of whiskey pirates again, so he needed a storage facility that was very well protected. And so George Connors found him this place. It was called Death Valley, in honor of whiskey pirates who tried to trespass and were never heard from again. There were armed men standing guard at strategic points. There were surveillance men everywhere. There was a signal that you had to know in order to gain entrance at the front. When you were down there, you had to flick your headlights in a certain way to signal that you did know the password. And when you were a well-known and recognized rum runner who was coming to Death Valley, Remus made sure to treat you like an invited guest. He would offer you a cot for the night. He would get the manager's wife to make hot meals. He would even start craps games where the preferred players would get a line of credit that they could pay off the next time they came. So it was a really well-run operation, and it really secured the loyalty to Remus because he treated these men so well. So Death Valley was very good at keeping out whiskey pirates, but not so great at keeping out prohibition agents, as Remus would soon learn. So this was just a fun thing I found during my research. This is actually an authentic speakeasy venue from a Chicago speakeasy in about circa 1925, 1926. And if you look there, you could just see some of the really great names for the cocktails. Absinthe Frap. There was a self-starter. There was a Maiden's Prayer. There's the Dirty Dick Special. My personal favorite is the Corpse Reviver, which, as you might surmise from the name, was a hangover cure. So, you know, if you had too much Maiden's Prayer or Dirty Dick special the night before, you would wake up and get your corpse reviver and all would be right with the world, sort of, you know, bite the dog that bit you. Also love the champagne cocktail that's 75 cents down there at the bottom. So just a really wonderful piece of history that I'm glad survived. And I found this in a historical society, I think in outside of Chicago. So here's George Remus with his mother. Marie Remus, aside from Imogene, Marie Remus was the most important person in George's life. As you can tell from this photo, George Remus was a bit of a mama's boy. She did have a very hard life herself. When she emigrated with her family, including Remus, when she was questioned by the immigration officials after she arrived in America, she was so beleaguered that she could not remember the names of 4 other children who had died. And she and Remus were always very close. And this closeness was illustrated by an incident that I find kind of fascinating and also very creepy. I mentioned that Remus's father had been a mean and abusive alcoholic. So as the story goes, one night, Marie Remus and her husband, George's father, were out at a local saloon in Chicago. They got into a fight, and Marie Remus bashed her husband over the head with a bottle of alcohol, and he died shortly thereafter from the wound. And Remus, wanting to protect his mother and from keeping her from speaking indiscriminately to the coroner, locked her in the attic for 3 days until the inquest was over, just so she couldn't speak out of turn and get herself in trouble. I just thought that was such a weird and interesting insight into how Remus approached his problems. Probably needless to say, Imogene Remus and Marie Remus did not get along. Remus was always very generous with his family members, especially with his mother, always giving her money, always supporting her. And of course, Imogene Remus wanted all of the money for herself. So Imogene, this was a very important incident in their lives. Remus was a very jealous person, but he wasn't jealous about money or things or artifacts or possessions or the trappings of wealth. He appreciated them, but he wasn't jealous about them. He was jealous about Imogene. It was the only thing that he really wanted to possess. And this is illustrated also by a rather bizarre and slightly disturbing incident. There was a story goes that Remus came home from a business trip one night, and Imogene Remus was not there. He asked a servant where she had gone, and the servant said she had traveled to Indianapolis with a salesman and a couple of friends. Now, George Remus knew who this salesman was. He didn't like this guy. He didn't trust this guy. He had expressly forbidden Imogene to associate with this person, and he knew exactly where they would be. He directed his driver to drive him out in the middle of the night to Indianapolis from Cincinnati, and he went straight to this hotel, the Claypole Hotel. In the 1920s, it was the most prestigious hotel in Indianapolis. And he went to the front desk and said, "Where is my wife registered? And where is this man registered?" And luckily for Remus and luckily for the man, they were registered in different rooms. And Remus had brought with him a loaded cane. Now, I had to look up what a loaded cane was, but it was basically a gentleman's accessory that was weighted at one end, so it could double as a weapon. So Remus takes the elevator. He goes up to this man's room. He knocks on the door. It's the middle of the night. This man stumbles out of bed. And what does he see but George Remus standing there at the doorway, wielding a cane above his head, ready to bring it down with forceful blows. And I'm just going to leave that there, and you'll read the book if you want to know how that incident ends. So by mid-1921, renovations on the mansion were complete. George and Imogene Remus spent about $12 million in today's money renovating their mansion. It was quite a bit of money. Here is a picture of their parlor. As you might tell from this photo, George Remus was not a minimalist. He sort of just threw everything in the room and wanted to see what would stick. I don't think I've ever seen so many naked pictures of cherubs and flowers crunched together in one room. That piano, by the way, you can't really tell from the photo, but it was a gold piano. And by the way, this is the second nonfiction book I've written that features a gold piano. The first gold piano was in Sin in the Second City. It was in a brothel, America's most lavish and famous brothel that was operated in Chicago in the early 1900s. And I like to think that the piano from the brothel ended up in Remus's home. But both pianos are missing. I don't know really what happened to them. But this is a picture of one of Remus's rooms. He collected various artifacts that he thought were interesting, including a authentic signature of George Washington's that was worth $50,000 at the time. And just kind of, just gives you an idea of what kind of home that they wanted to build for themselves. Here's another room. This is a solarium. It's definitely more tastefully decorated. I love the detailing here, the sort of fringe on the lamps, just a wonderful detailing of this room, and I think definitely more tasteful than the other one. But basically the mansion represented George and Imogene's desire to be accepted by society. You know, they both had come from very poor backgrounds, had hard scrabble childhoods, and this was finally saying, you know, we arrived and we're just as valid and respectable as anybody with old money. The Taft family, of course, was in Cincinnati. They wanted to be respected by the Tafts and the Sintons and the Longworths and other very important family names. So this was one of their ways of going about trying to get that acceptance. And also to that end, they decided to throw a very lavish New Year's Eve party. Here is a picture of the actual invitation. I was astounded this still exists, and very grateful to whoever saved this invitation. I found it at the Delhi Historical Society outside of Cincinnati. If you can't read the writing on here, it's cameo pictures, and says Mr. and Mrs. George E. Remus, our New Year's greeting, dive to health, swim to wealth, float on happiness, 1921, 1922. And considering the level of debauchery they planned for this party, I always find the mom and the baby kind of a weird, incongruous picture to add to this invitation. But Imogene designed these invitations, and Imogene got what Imogene wanted. And these invitations did go out to all of high society, politicians, judges, lawyers, businessmen, robber barons, the Tafts, etc., all the important families that Remus's wanted to impress. So here's Imogene Remus on the night of the party in her brand new boudoir, which I love this photograph. Clearly she hired a photographer, a professional photographer, to catch her gazing at herself in this really sort of striking moment of self-actualization. You know, here she is kind of saying to the world, I am Mrs. Imogene Remus, and I am somebody, and I've arrived. And so this was her sort of entree into the life that she hoped to achieve for herself, the societal acceptance. So I love this cartoon. Here is a picture of what actually happened at the party, because I don't think any pictures really survived. And it sort of depicts all of the things that had happened. They had hired synchronized swimmers. You can see that they're raising and lowering out of sight here, the water nymphs. Guests used the diving board as a rostrum to deliver toasts. There was all kind of champagne going on. There was actually a rumor that that Remus was going to fill the pool with whiskey that night. And here, of course, is Imogene Remus in her daring one piece, about to execute a perfect dive. One of the highlights of this party was the unveiling of Remus's swimming pool. It was a heated pool, which, as you can imagine, for 1921 was pretty much unheard of. They also had a variety of baths, needle baths, including electric baths, which I had to look up what electric baths were, but apparently they were an early version of a tanning bed, heated by incandescent lights and said to make the user frisky. Which to me just sounds like you're going to electrocute yourself, but apparently these things were very popular at the time. And also remarkable about this party are the favors that Remus handed out to all of his guests. All of the men got a gold watch and an engraved diamond stick pin. Every woman got a brand new 1922 car. Of course, this was decades before Oprah. You know, you get a car and you get a car. Every single woman got a brand new 1922 car. And in an excessive gesture that would be remembered for decades later, every single guest got a $1,000 bill tucked beneath their dinner plate. That would be the equivalent of you and I looking under our chairs or our plates right now and finding $14,000, which is kind of astounding. And in a gesture emblematic of the times, one that, again, also would be remembered with all decades later, Remus lit his guests cigars with $100 bills. Now, mind you, this was in an era when the average annual salary was $1,200. So it's just a really staggering display of wealth. So here's an actual picture of the engraved watches that Remus gave out. It says from Mr. and Mrs. George Remus, 1921. Remus's insignia is at the top. He had that branded on many things that he owned. And, you know, one of the most fascinating aspects of this book to me and of George Remus was that he was a real life inspiration for the character of Jay Gatsby in The Great Gatsby. And there were all of these apocryphal tales that George Remus and F. Scott Fitzgerald met when Fitzgerald was stationed in Louisville during his military service. There's no hard evidence that the two men ever met, but without a doubt, F. Scott Fitzgerald knew who George Remus was when he was drafting The Great Gatsby. By then, the entire world knew who George Remus was, and I think the parallels between the two men are very conspicuous. Both men owned a string of pharmacies. Both men were obsessed with a mysterious woman. Both through these lavish parties and their incredible mansions. And as Fitzgerald wrote, Gatsby sprang from a platonic conception of himself, wanting to inhabit a world that didn't quite want him, wanting to inhabit a world where he didn't quite belong. And I think that George Remus and Jay Gatsby have that in common. They both sort of long to belong to an atmosphere and a world that really wasn't welcoming to them and where they never quite fit in. So this is one of my, little suspense drink here. One of my favorite characters in the book. This such a rich and complicated character. This is Mabel Walker Willebrandt. I always need to have a badass woman character in my books, and this is one for Ghosts of Eden Park. She was also a character on Boardwalk Empire, if anybody would watch. She was Esther Randolph on there. And when Warren Harding appointed her to be the Assistant Attorney General of the United States in 1921, women had only had the right to vote in this country for 9 months. She was only 32 years old, 5 years out of law school, and had never prosecuted a single case in her entire career. And suddenly she was in charge of all prohibition cases, thousands and thousands of prohibition cases across the country, including cases against George Remus. And it's pretty certain that her crooked bosses in the White House and at the Justice Department, who were all in bed with bootleggers and other various crooked people, thought, you know, let's put the little lady in charge. She's going to be overwhelmed. She's not going to quite know what she's doing, but she's going to, and we're going to be able to continue our cozy relationship with the bootleggers. So what happens? Mabel Walker Willebrandt takes her oath of office in September of 1921, and immediately, to their surprise, begins kicking some butt. She was the most powerful woman in the country. You can imagine the rampant sexism that she dealt with. And she was very vocal about that, to her credit. Here's a tiny excerpt of a piece she wrote for the Smart Set magazine, comparing the world's treatment of boys and girls. A boy must do the job well and develop personality. A girl must do the job well and develop personality, plus break down skepticism about her ability, walk the tightrope of sexlessness without loss of her essential charm, and make the hard choice between giving up children and home life in order to advance or having them in the face of increased prejudice. So in a way, not much has changed today. And another really incredible thing about Willebrandt, she was almost completely deaf. She had a serious hearing problem. She spent an hour each morning arranging her hair to conceal her hearing aids, as you can see in this picture. She was almost inhumanly tough and thick-skinned, qualities that were reinforced by the ice-cold bath she took every morning. Her favorite saying was, "Life has few petted darlings," and she definitely did not consider herself one of them. One of her formative child event, and I thought was kind of fascinating, she once bit a pet cat's ear, and to teach her a lesson, her father bit her ear back. So that gives you an idea into Willebrandt's mindset. Soon after Remus's party, a letter landed on her desk. It was from a concerned resident of Cincinnati, and it said, "All of Cincinnati is well aware that Remus spends lavishly on riotous living, owns no fewer than 40 automobiles, and dispenses enough liquor from his drug companies to meet the prescriptions of physicians of the whole central United States." So clearly the feds in Cincinnati needed her help, and Willebrandt was up to the challenge. Now this is a guy, also he was in Boardwalk Empire. This is Jess Smith. Willebrandt had many factors working against her and her desire to enforce prohibition. Crooked politicians were a main part of that. This is Jess Smith, and Willebrandt, he worked up the hallway in an office in the Justice Department, not too far from Willebrandt's own office, but she had no idea what he did. She called him a glorified valet. He ran errands for her immediate boss, who was Attorney General Harry Doherty, but she really didn't know what he did all day. I will tell you this, though. George Remus knew exactly who Jess Smith was and what he did, because Jess Smith was Remus's liaison to the federal government. Remus and Smith met often, and they constructed a deal between each other. Jess Smith promised Remus a couple things. One was that Remus would not get arrested. If he were arrested, he would not get convicted. If he were convicted, he would not go to prison. And if by chance he went to prison, Jess Smith would use his relationship with the Attorney General of the United States to get Remus out of prison. The other thing he gave Remus were authentic government withdrawal permits that would allow him to get his whiskey out of the warehouse without worrying about his certificates looking like forgeries, et cetera. It was always better to have government withdrawal permits. And for these services, Remus paid him handsomely, about $1 million in protection payments to Jess Smith that were filtered out throughout the federal government. And George Remus considered Jess Smith his ace in the hole, but the arrangement would not last very long. Dun, dun, dun. Here's another one of my favorite cartoons. Here is a cartoon depicting Willenbrandt's The Futility of Her Job. That the headline here is "Give the little girl a hand," and she's equipped with a broom trying to sweep back a literal ocean of alcohol. And it really sort of captures her challenge as well. You know, one of Willenbrandt's main challenges, aside from crooked politicians, was the United States itself. You know, we have 2 long, craggy borders and 1,800 miles of coastline, all of it very unnervingly porous. There were airplane fleets coming in, smuggling from Mexico to Texas filled with liquor. There were also fleets coming in from Canada to the Michigan Peninsula every night. These were guided by searchlights, and it was a very organized procedure. There were liquor submarines that raised and lowered out of sight. And on an individual level, there were so many ways of smuggling booze. One of my favorites was that a W amputee boasted that he could hold 36 pints in his prosthetics. Women said that they could hide pints inside of their false rubber breasts. I think today they call them chicken cutlets, but they were hiding alcohol behind those. And on a personal level too, many inventions came about on the market that really helped people smuggle their alcohol around. This is one of my favorites. At first glance, this woman is reading a book. She's holding a book called The Four Swallows by J.B. Corn, a not very subtle reference to John Barleycorn. But you flip open the top of this and you see it's a flask. There are 4 vials there. You're able to fill those vials with any alcohol of your choosing, hence the name The Four Swallows. This was a very popular invention. It was the work of a Brooklyn-based inventor named John Nuttry. Before Prohibition, he made a name for himself by creating little personal coin banks that looked like books. But as soon as Prohibition hit, he patented this in February of 1921, and it became a really popular item. There are actually a couple of them today on auction sites like Ruby Lane and such, and they're quite expensive, but what a really interesting thing. So at first glance, this woman is merely sitting in a cafe enjoying her cup of coffee. Oh, but what is she doing with her cane? She's dumping a bunch of alcohol in her coffee and not being very subtle about it. This is another popular invention. The canes hit a little compartment that you would screw off, and inside was a glass vial that you could fill with your favorite alcohol and just dump it into any drink that you were having out in public. There are reproduction canes like this on eBay. I actually own one, and as soon as we're allowed to go out to bars again, I am going to give it a shot. So I like to call this one "My, What a Big Flask You Have." It's actually called the Bootlegger's Life Preserver. And it was very popular among women who wanted to smuggle a good volume of alcohol. Now, women were very crafty at smuggling alcohol, and that was for a couple reasons. The most important one was that they knew Prohibition agents, who were mostly male, were either too polite or too nervous to search women. And in some states, it was actually illegal to search women at all. And women knew this. They took full advantage of it. And so they would hide liquor on any person, any part of their body that they could get away with, in their garter belt and their bloomers, underneath their fur coats, inside their brassiere, anything. And they knew that they would have a good chance of really getting away with it because the men would not search them. Now, these are called cow shoes. They did not hold liquor, but they were indispensable to bootleggers who manufactured whiskey, especially in forests or meadows, especially down south. And they did not hold liquor, but you can see that the heels are carved from a wooden block and made to resemble hooves. So if you were fleeing from a prohibition agent, they literally covered your tracks. The prohibition agent would be looking on the ground, looking for your footsteps, and instead would just see a bunch of animal hoof prints and get lost. So it was really kind of a genius invention. I have searched eBay. These have not been, not come back in style. I would really love a pair for myself. And here they are modeled by a prohibition agent, I think in 1924. Which brings me to another problem that Willebrandt had in enforcing prohibition. She could not find good prohibition agents. Good, hard prohibition agents were very hard to come by, and there were a couple reasons for that. Number one was that the average starting salary was only $1,200, which was barely a living wage in certain parts of the country. Also, there were absolutely no qualifications required to become a prohibition agent. They would do the recruiting at courthouses, pick up courtroom gadflies, pick up traffic cops, anything. You could even have a criminal record and become a prohibition agent. One story I found was that a man was doing time in an upstate New York prison for armed robbery and murder, and when he got his prohibition badge. So were there really no requirements at all? And Willebrandt wrote often about this frustration. She wrote, the dominant reality is that the whole problem is one of getting the right men in places of power and enforcement, men of creative thought, of courage, and those not slaves to political ambition. And by men, I also mean women, lots of them. So of course, she had quite a rough road ahead on that front. So Willebrandt's best hope was this guy. His name was Franklin Dodge. If you've read the book, you know he becomes a very important part of the story. Franklin Dodge was a prohibition agent from a very pedigreed Michigan family. His father was a very prominent politician there. He got and a prominent lawyer, very well-connected, wealthy family. He got Franklin Dodge his first government job, and Franklin Dodge quickly just rose up the ranks. He was the sort of kind of guy who just, kept advancing because of nepotism, really. But Mabel Walker Willebrandt saw something in him. He was willing to go undercover to try to entrap bootleggers. He was willing to do sort of subversive things, all within the law, usually. But Willebrandt thought he was above board, and he was just very innovative in catching bootleggers. So she decided to send him, Franklin Dodge, to go after George Remus's empire. And Franklin Dodge was a good enough prohibition agent that he succeeded in getting Remus put behind bars, despite all of Jess Smith's promises and all the money that Remus had paid to Jess Smith. But that's not the last time that George Remus and Franklin Dodge would meet. They would meet again when Remus was serving his sentence at the Atlanta Penitentiary. Dodge had gone down there this time to try to investigate alleged corruption among prison officials. And by this time, George Remus had begun hearing things about Franklin Dodge, hearing that he wasn't maybe as honest and trustworthy as Mabel Walker Willebrandt thought. He was amenable to a quid pro quo. He was not opposed to doing business with bootleggers. And George Remus had an idea. He was desperate to get out of prison. So he told Imogene the next time that she visited him at prison, go and cultivate Franklin Dodge. See if you can arrange a deal. See if he can help me get out of prison. If I offer information about other bootleggers, if I pay him some money, he might be amenable to a quid pro quo. So please, my darling Imogene, go out and cultivate Franklin Dodge. Now, Imogene and Remus began cultivating Franklin Dodge, but not quite in the manner that George Remus had hoped. So here's another interesting thing I kept coming across in my research. At the time that George Remus was in prison in Atlanta, Imogene Remus was 39 years old. And I began noticing a lot of comments about flappers and sort of a backlash against flappers, especially middle-aged flappers, because these women were old enough to know better. Now, New York Times described a middle-aged flapper like Imogene Remus as, quote, a woman who deposits her husband at home and goes out in search of culture. Of course, Franklin Dodge became Imogene's culture. And to me, this was just an interesting theme of the book. Women were subverting societal expectations and mores, and what were the consequences of this? I think we can all agree that the 1920s were a singularly rich and dynamic time in American history. We had just emerged from World War II. The war swept away a lot of gender norms because women left home in large numbers and flooded the workplace. And America afterward found itself in this really interesting in-between period. You know, people were more hedonistic after realizing that life could be so short. And the Depression had yet to come along and put a damper on everything. And of course, a lot of men were upset and even angry that their mothers, their sisters, their daughters, their sweethearts, their wives suddenly had the right to vote. And there was a backlash against that. And the backlash was against women who defied societal conventions. And people were especially angry at middle-aged flappers because they were old enough to know better. One newspaper admonished middle-aged flappers this way: "Everyone knows that there is a certain type of American woman of a certain age who spends her life trying to be like the girls. The woman who finds herself earnestly mimicking the voice, mannerisms, and dress of the poor little flapper girls of any age is a greater menace than the 16-year-old kind." So as for the 16-year-old kind, they were also considered to be very dangerous in society, part of the flapper menace. And they actually developed their own magazine, which is really quite wonderful. The tagline for this magazine was "Not for Old Fogies." And they defined a flapper. They had a fabulous definition for a flapper. It was somebody with a jitney body and a limousine mind, which I think needs to come back into vogue also. And here is a part of their dictionary. They had, of course, had their own slang. Some of my favorite terms on here: a barlow was a girl, a flapper, a chicken. Banks closed meant that no petting was allowed, no kisses were allowed. A biscuit was a pettable flapper. A boob tickler was a girl who entertains father's out-of-town customers. And a canceled stamp was a wallflower. Just kind of an interesting little insight into flapper culture. Flappers were also considered to be sexual predators, believe it or not. And this cartoon really made me laugh. The first panel over here says, "Guileless youth pursued by cuties with bobbed hair and stocking flasks." And the middle one is actually my favorite. It says, "Unsuspecting boys forced to endure such unseemly exercises as cheek dancing." Oh my goodness, imagine cheek dancing just being such a, clearly corrupting all of the boys of America with that cheek dancing. So again, women were responsible for the downfall of all of America's youth. You might recognize this guy. This is J. Edgar Hoover. He was also a big part of the book. He was in 1924, J. Edgar Hoover was 1929 when he was named the director of the Bureau of Investigation, which was the precursor to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. J. Edgar Hoover would never have been appointed this post without Mabel Walker Willebrandt. She is the one who recommended him for the job. She got him this job. And I love the idea of Mabel Willebrandt bossing around baby Edgar, as I called him during my research. Just the idea of him getting bossed around by a woman was really kind of funny to me. And J. Edgar Hoover, say what you want about him. Of course, he was responsible for all kinds of nefarious deeds while he was holding this position. But J. Edgar Hoover, during Prohibition, really wanted an honest force of Prohibition agents. He did not want any corruption on his staff. He wanted people who were not taking bribes, who were not working with bootleggers. He really wanted a true and honest force of Prohibition agents. And he, J. Edgar Hoover, just like George Remus, had begun hearing things about Franklin Dodge, hearing that he was taking bribes, he was working with bootleggers, and most disturbingly, he heard that Franklin Dodge was running around with Imogene Remus, the wife of the biggest bootlegger in the country. So what does J. Edgar Hoover do? He sends one of his own agents to spy on Franklin Dodge, sort of a spy versus spy situation. And what does Hoover's agent discover? He discovers that that Franklin Dodge and Imogene Remus are taking artifacts from Remus's mansion. They're stealing his whiskey certificates and trying to sell them. And in one instance, J. Edgar Hoover's agent literally catches Franklin Dodge with his pants down. It is not often in nonfiction research that you actually have a scene where you can catch somebody with their pants down. It was quite a bit of fun to write. And one of the reasons I often think, nonfiction is stranger than fiction. It was just a really fun scene to write. But just to put things in perspective as a whole, in this book, J. Edgar Hoover is actually one of the good guys, hard to believe. So here's George Remus in prison in Atlanta Penitentiary. Do not let his morose expression fool you. George Remus lived quite in a lap of luxury in prison. He was able to redecorate his cell to his taste. He hired his own maid. He hired his own private cook. He would take his dinners in a separate room on a long mahogany table with a beautiful linen tablecloth where he would be served. He often held dinner parties with his fellow bootlegger prisoners. And his Imogene would come and visit him, and she would be allowed to stay over, and she would also scrub his cell on her hands and knees. His fellow prisoners actually called her the angel of the pen. But still, Remus was truly miserable. Remus was miserable because he did not have control. You know, this man was a control freak. And while he's in prison, he is not in control of what's happening to his money, what's happening to his empire, what's happening to his business. And most important, he was not in control of what his wife was doing. And Remus also began hearing rumors about her and Franklin Dodge. He heard that they were having a torrid affair. And he was tormented by this, as you can imagine. He was quite disturbed. And the more disturbed that Remus became, the more unhinged he started to act. And I get into this in the book quite a bit. But my favorite part of his time in prison were the letters that he wrote to Imogene Remus, each of them more unhinged than the last, and really do show the affinity for language that I spoke about earlier. And I'm just going to read excerpts of two of my favorite letters from George Remus to Imogene. To the only true and sweetest little girl in the whole dear world, to the apple of my eye, not one, but both. How glorious it feels to know that my sweetheart is cheery again. Little one, you do not know what it means to have you away from me for long. The minutes turn into days, the days into months, and the months into years. I crave you. I would devour you. I care only for you, a human madness. All other matters are infinitesimal against you, and only you. Therefore, you see how I burst into a human cloud, burst with a vitriolic tongue interspersed. My only wife, how is it that you are a monkey? You are a centipede. You are a gem. You are a jewel. You are a combination of all the aforesaid in one. If I but had you this very moment, I would demonstrate all of the foregoing with a real vigor and vim unexcelled. How about it? Now, I love that. I don't know any other couple who would use centipede as a term of endearment, but apparently it worked for George and Imogene Remus. It was one of his many nicknames for her. So every time Imogene Remus would come to prison and visit George, you know, he would say, honey, are you cultivating Dodge? What's going on with Dodge? Am I any closer to getting out of prison? And Imogene Remus would just assure him, don't worry, Daddy, Mr. Dodge is our friend. So this is Harry Truesdale. This is the hitman that Franklin Dodge and Imogene Remus hired to kill George Remus. And just to give you a sense of how crazy things actually get in this book, at one point, this hardened killer, this hired professional hitman, is so terrified of both George and Imogene Remus that he fears them both, and he thinks he's the one that's going to get killed. So just, I'll leave that there, and you can see how things work out with that. And here's my final slide. This is George Remus's grave. He was buried in Falmouth, Kentucky, and there's a really great story that goes along with his tombstone. You know, the lore is that a letter was received saying that George Remus, having lived the life he lived, did not deserve to have angels on his tombstone. So the very next day, somebody went out and took a hammer and knocked the angels right off of George Remus's tombstone. And this is how they appear today. You can see where the angel wings were knocked off. And that's how it stands now. Could use a good bath, but certainly missing the wings. And I like to finish by saying, you know, the people who do what I do, who write narrative nonfiction, we often lament that we're beholden to the historical record. You know, we're not allowed to make up any dialogue. We're not to make up any characters or any events. It's usually really limiting in some ways. But I'm very happy to report that the Ghost of Eden Park represents the very first time when the dead people did exactly what I wanted them to do. So anyway, that concludes my slideshow. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them now. If you have any scandalous tales of prohibition from your own family, I'd love to hear them. So thanks again for coming. And please, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen. Thank you very, very much. And as we said before, go on the bottom of your screen with the chat feature there, and you just type in your question. I'm glad you mentioned that Remus, if he wasn't the direct inspiration for Gatsby, he certainly paralleled it. So So if he was a direct inspiration, I can see that. What was the? Tell us more about Mabel Willebrandt. How long was her career? What were some of the other highlights?
Oh, she's just fascinating. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you know, I think her and Remus have some interesting parallels, even though they were on opposite ends of law here. As I mentioned, Remus was a teetotaler who never drank a drop of alcohol. Meanwhile, Mabel Willebrandt, before Prohibition, the lady liked to have a drink. The woman liked her California wine. She was from California. She had spent most of her career there. And the woman really liked to have her drink. She grew up in on various farms in the sort of in the middle of the country. George Remus quit his formal schooling at age 13. She only began her formal schooling at age 13. And she's opened her career in Los Angeles. She was the first female public defender. And she took cases, she defended women mostly prostitutes. And she was quite innovative in that. She's pushed for a law that would require the Johns to show up in court, so that it wasn't just the woman being prosecuted. And later on, she is the one who pushed for the law that where you could go after bootleggers for tax evasion. She is the one who sort of set in motion the mechanism that would get Al Capone eventually arrested. So that was another big milestone of her career. Really a fantastic woman. She also adopted, I write about this in the book, she adopted a child. She was a single woman who adopted a child in the 1920s, which again was really unorthodox and rare for the time.
There's a question for you. How did you decide what information from your research was included in the book?
Oh God, it was hard because I had so much great research for this book, in addition to the 5,500-page trial transcript, which really gave me dialogue. If anything, it was really wonderful for the amount of dialogue. That it was an unusual amount of dialogue for nonfiction. You really don't often get to have that much. But there were also really great. Mabel Walker Willebrandt has her papers at the Library of Congress, which were really wonderful. I quote, she was quite close with her parents, and she writes some very poignant letters throughout her career talking about its difficulties in her personal life and her frustrations with her hearing aid and her hearing problems, and how that was an impediment to her already exceptional career, and how much more she could be capable of if she didn't have this terrible handicap that she was working with. There were also really great FBI files, declassified files on Franklin Dodge, memos between J. Edgar Hoover and Willebrandt talking about Dodge. So really, I just had a beautiful plethora of research. And it was hard to pick what went in there. You know, there was just so much great stuff. But the outline, I'm a very rigorous outliner I learned the hard way to outline books. And the fact that it was 85,000 words itself was quite a challenge, but you always want to have more material than less. You always want to go overboard rather than try to stretch things. So I was really lucky in this one. I don't think I've ever had so much fun researching a book.
You had mentioned that Remus had started in Chicago before he went to Cincinnati. I'm guessing this predates Capone. You just mentioned that. So, yes. So they didn't know each other, did they? Or
well, Remus had one of his clients, Johnny Torrio, who was Al Capone's predecessor. And Capone really came into his own after George Remus. You know, Remus, for all of the money he made, the staggering money he made, was not in the business for very long. You know, he was only in there for about a year and a half, 2 years. And it was pre-Capone, but he dealt with Capone's, predecessors. And I often wonder, you know, people often ask too, why is Capone the household name? Why doesn't anybody remember who George Remus was when George Remus was actually the more successful bootlegger? And I think it's because George Remus, you know, he created his empire with intellect. Capone built his empire with systematic violence. So, you know, those indelible images of the Tommy guns and the men lined up along the wall on, Valentine's Day Massacre and the sort of gory photos that accompanied Capone's reign of terror. George Remus was a low-key guy. I think he called himself the gentleman's bootlegger. He really was somebody who wanted to impress with his intellect and conduct business as sort of discreetly as possible.
Question for you. It sounds like you did so much research. How long did it take you to write?
It's a good question, and I learned the hard way that I have to research and write at the same time. And I'll tell you the story behind that. So for my first book, Sin in the Second City, I decided, oh, I'm going to do all of my research and then I'm going to start writing. I think that will be the smart thing to do. And so the book was about the world's most famous brothel, and I started researching contraceptive methods in the early 1900s because it was a relevant topic. And I probably spent the next 5 weeks, looking at various sheepskin condoms and the various pills that women took, all these remedies that they would try to take to prevent pregnancy. And then I go to write it. I write about a paragraph on this, and it ends up being in the finished the finished book, about 2 sentences. And I realized, oh my God, I wasted 5 weeks on this bit of research. It was fascinating, but it really did not serve the end book. It wasn't worth the investment for what I got out of it at the end. So I learned the hard way that I have to research and write at the same time, which is why I started becoming a very rigorous outliner. I always know where the story is going to go. There are always surprises along the way, and there's always going to be surprising research and scenes and details that I can fill in. But I know if I'm going to go on a tangent, I know that tangent is going to be relevant and it's going to stay in the finished book. And so that was a long answer to your short question, which is it took me about 3.5, 4 years to write and research this book, which is actually probably a pretty short period of time. It came very quickly to me, I think, because I don't know, I was so interested in the characters, the story.
What are you working on now, or what's the next project?
Well, I am submitted a proposal about a 1930s murder mystery set in the Galapagos Islands that I'm really hoping my publisher accepts. So finger crossed for that. And I'm also working on a novel, which would be a new thing for me. So.
All right, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. This has been a great pleasure. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Stay safe, everyone. Our next talk is tomorrow night at 6:30. It's not at 7, it's at 6:30. So, Karen, great luck with this book. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I also want to add, if anybody has a book club, I happily Skype into your book club, which is always a fun thing to do, especially in quarantine. And feel free to email me with any other questions you might think of, abbottauthor@gmail.com. And thanks again for coming. I really had fun doing this with you all.
All right. Thank you, Karen, very much. Good luck with the book. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and good night. And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow night. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.